Good evening. Today is Monday, June 13, 2022, and this is the 101st episode of New Paradigms. I'm your host, Sargis Sangari. In this very special 101st episode, we have brought to you a very special guest and a friend who I would say Americans and our allies need to pay a very close attention to. Jennifer Zeng is the host of the YouTube channel Inconvenient Truths by Jennifer Zeng, which aims really at offering a authentic, fastest, and also an uncensored first-hand account of information that are coming out of China. She has a unique in-depth analysis and also an insightful insight by China's current affairs and politics. Jennifer is a former researcher at the Development Research Center of the State Council of the People's Republic of China. And for those who understand, China is the highest level of governmental policy research and also consultant body within China. Ms. Zhang has been working in the media industry as a journalist, as an editor, a news producer, news director, and also columnist and a TV show host since she left China in 2001. I would say that Jennifer has recently uncovered the CCP discussing plans for really open invasion against the democratic free nation of Taiwan. On the heels of what we say Putin's invasion of Ukraine, it seems that the CCP is now repeating his actions against the island nation of Taiwan while unbelievably even blaming Japan in the process of it. The last few weeks, for those who've been following China, have been a whirlwind of revelations about the CCP's true intentions and also the deadly possible potential for millions of Asians that will be crushed under the CCP dictatorship in Taiwan, Southeast Asia, and potentially even parts of Japan if this invasion takes place. Jennifer has courageously and tirelessly brought us revelations to the public in the hopes of averting the decree that is coming out of Beijing. But we have to ask whether or not it's too late and what can be done about it. For a historical and also informational war context, we have also brought back our returning guest and a member of the NECSC board, Al Johnson, who has been really following CCP information wars, capabilities, and campaigns for decades now. Al, it's good to have you back. And Jennifer, thank you very much for spending some quality time on your busy schedule with us. I had read some of your blogs and Twitters, and recently the Japan Forward article, which Jason Morgan, a dear friend of both Al and I, had published, capturing your viewpoints. I guess the CCP doesn't seem to be acting responsibly or even morally anymore, and I would say they're planning for a direct invasion of Taiwan and parts of Japan by some accounts. I would like to know if you can elaborate on the situation you found transitioning the evidence of what is happening with the CCP.
Yes, I was alerted by the leaked audio, top secret audio file of the war mobilization meeting happening in Guangdong on May 14th. I listened to that audio very carefully, and because it sounds so true, because I come from China. I worked with the Chinese government consultant body for a while. So everything sounds to me very, very true, like many people were talking, and the word, the jargon, everything they use, it sounds, because we don't have any other information or source to make any other judgment. I can only base my judgment on the audio itself. I tend to believe it is true, so I think it is very important to translate this whole video in full into English, because if this is really what they say the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP, intends to do, it will going to be affect virtually everybody in the world. So I spent, I think, several days to translate the whole thing. It was a torture process because the language they use is so unique CCP way of expressing things. You can't find any equivalent language or words in English. So it killed a lot of my, I think, brain cells in that process. Anyway, I got it done and I released it on YouTube, and then I got banned from YouTube for 2 weeks after that. Anyway, I think this is very valuable information. Some people, I think, want to dismiss it as maybe it's just an exercise or it's just faked video. But if you check all the details in that audio, or you can check that the script on my website, you will know this is not something that can be faked, because so many details were mentioned in that file. And also, like I said, I'm an investigative reporter once. So I investigate all the details, like they mentioned many names. I check those names, I check the public record, and they also mentioned a lot of factories, labs, and what kind of job those factories should be given into this whole thing. I check the names of this factory, and I check what they do, and it all match perfectly with the public record. So in the end, I conclude this should be something that's very much like real, or even if it's an exercise, they are doing it like a real, like when we do rehearsal for something, we really put on everything that we are going to put on the stage. So from the translation process, and also because I've been following China news very, very closely in the past 2 years, especially since the pandemic. So judging from the recent events, it all indicating the CCP is cutting itself away from the world on its own. It's closing its gate. So everything indicate, I think, point to the one thing that it has been talking about for decades. I think just several days ago, the defense minister, Mr. Wei Fenghe, said in Singapore, in the Sangari summit, that liberating Taiwan, or anyone who wants to split Taiwan from China, has only one way to go, which is to die. That is public, high-profile declaration at an international meeting. So all this indicating, or all this, what's happening events in China point out to this one direction, that we need to really to get ourselves be prepared.
Jennifer, you did mention that, CCP use a certain type of a language, and I was looking at your dispatch today, and it said that the dictator of the CCP, Xi Jinping, authorized the Red Army and also the Navy to be dispatched overseas for what he called, quote unquote, operations other than war. Similar kind of a language that Putin is using. He doesn't even call war invasion of Ukraine. What do you think, based on your understanding of how the CCP talks, that they are looking at when it comes to saying what they said, operations other than war?
Yes, judging when I first, because the news this morning, I saw it very early on, I think some 7:30 something in the morning in New York time. So the announcement itself is very short, maybe only 200 words or something. It's a very, I think, of course, the non-war military operation immediately made us, think about Putin's special military operation. It sounds very similar, but the wording itself, the first thing came to my mind is Xi Jinping is trying to prevent coup attempts inside China using, he wants to use military in his control to deal with any political enemies, as well as the possible social unrest in China. That's my first, impression and reaction after read that very short announcement. So I sent my first tweet. And very shortly, other people starting, retweeting and commenting and adding their insights. So I very quickly I realized that there could be another possibility. That is, it is trying to, getting itself ready for an attack on Taiwan, but use a special military operation or non-war military operation. And then in the afternoon, the English translation of the official English translation from Xinhua also is available. So if you check my Twitter, you can say that they mentioned this is to protect people's life and property, safeguard national sovereignty, security, and development interests, and safeguard world peace and regional stability. So when you read those things between the lines, by the way, if you read any CCP stuff, you always need to read between the lines. Just don't read it or look at it on the face value. So if you read those between the lines, safeguard national sovereignty. This is a very, I think, direct declaration of our sovereignty over Taiwan, because the CCP is always talking about Taiwan is part of China. Anyone who wants to split Taiwan from China will have to die. Security and development interest. This is also, I think, in line with one of CCP's top scholar, Chen Wenling's recent declaration that we need to take back, in her words, Taiwan, and we need to take back Taiwan semiconductor manufacturing company.
TSMC.
Yes, so that's the security and development interest in it, because if the CCP doesn't have enough chips, of course it will affect its economy or not, and then safeguard world peace and regional stability. Actually, this reveal the intention that this is about the world peace, of course, they're said, and the regional stability. So its regional could be include Taiwan, South Asia, Southeast Asia. So this, I think, revealed their intention of. So I'd like to call this order that Xi Jinping signed today is both. It can both deal with any international and in domestic issue. I think they have two purposes at the same time.
No, you're right. And, you mentioned the possibility of an invasion. I mean, the Dow today dropped below 1,000 points, and people are complaining about inflation and what's happening, and the fact that the Fed would have to raise interest. A lot of our multi-industrial complex weapon systems that we need to use a war with possibly a CCP in the future has already been shipped to Ukraine, and we're kind of short on those stocks. But I can just imagine if this action takes place over the next couple of months, what would happen to the stock market. And I don't know if our fail-safes would be able to control the actual implosion that would happen if China decides to get into Taiwan. But, I want our viewers to also know that, as I said earlier, we have Al on the phone today with us. And Al, you as a director, not just as a board member of NEC, but sitting in the directorship, looking at Asia and Southeast Asia. Based on what Jennifer is saying, what do you think that they are looking at, perhaps, in addition to, or God forbid, after they invade China, when it comes to the order or the wording, other than war orders that might be executed out there?
Well, first off, she's absolutely right. You look at the nuances and language of what they use, because they choose language very carefully. It's kind of inculcated within the CCP from the beginning that they would use language as a weapon, right? They don't see it as separate from kinetic operations. Information operations and kinetic operations is what we call them, is integral to the CCP. In fact, they've relied for the last 70 years more on informational warfare and kind of corruption warfare than any kinetic warfare. And so they're very adept at it. And so what Jennifer mentioned was, they said in that statement, the world and the regional security. So by placing it, the shift in language that we see they're taking on a much more aggressive stance. And this is reflected in their actual positioning of assets globally. As I think we mentioned before the show, they've been positioning, for over a decade to slowly position assets to control the areas around Taiwan. So the 9-dash line they pushed out. So these pronouncements that they're making aren't just empty talk or empty rhetoric, such as, for example, North Korea frequently will have some bellicose language, or, you'll get some Middle Eastern country that will, make a pronouncement and rattle the sabers is what we call it, but they haven't done anything actual to progress forward toward that goal that they're saying on the radio or on the news or things like that. In this case, however, we have had decades of slow positioning into maneuvers. And now once they've kind of set up the set pieces in the battle, now they make their pronouncements. Now they begin to prepare the battlefield information wise when they've already set the pieces. So we can see, for example, when they set the islands, they created that, as Admiral said, Great Wall of Sand. They began to make these man-made islands. They pushed the 9-dash line out. They began to corrupt, the Philippine government. They almost had Taiwan internally by corrupting kind of the Kuomintang government. But luckily, Freddie Lim and those guys kind of had the Sunflower Movement and, pushed back against that. The people of Taiwan kind of pushed back against that almost a coup in Taiwan that took over Taiwan by other means. But they've set these pieces in there. The Panama Canal, as you know, Hutchison Whampoa has grabbed strategic points in the Panama Canal. They've moved into Africa. Sudan is being, and other African nations are being kind of bled dry. They set up military and observational bases just yesterday, 2 days ago. Nicaragua announced that Russia, an ACO partner of China, is allowed to move people and bases. They already have a base there, but they are now allowed to put soldiers and sailors there. And it will only be, moments before the SCO partner China is able to move their forces in there now that Xi has given his decree. So we see now kind of this global move of the CCP where they've been slowly positioning it. And before they were talking softly, but moving, adeptly, moving, surreptitiously. Now they're openly saying that they can go for it, which indicates to me it's either one of two things. Either Xi is saying it's now or never because the U.S. is probably the weakest that it has been in 20 years, and that he sees that we might recover from this and then push back against China as we did the last 4 years, or he feels so strongly in his position that it's like now we've got this. He's positioned so much globally that his intel is saying we got this. So, but either path at how he sees it is dangerous because it can lead to a kinetic war. Now, where does this lead regionally? As you know, the CCP is very involved in Cambodia, Southeast Asia. So they have Cambodia, they have Burma, they have lots of, they're building military bases in Cambodia with their puppet General Chiang in Burma. They've got the Arakan region, the pipeline. So internal communication in there. They've been working to co-opt Middle Eastern countries, as you know, Africa. And then we've seen indications that they're moving into South and Central America. So all of these maneuvers that they've made indicate that there is a global operation underway. And so we have to look at it that way. The other thing I'd like to point out, though, is that most Americans don't recognize, when we say the one China policy, that's kind of a misnomer. That came about with kind of a compromise diplomatically, but it didn't reflect kind of historical realities. And the CCP has a problem with Taiwan because it has always wanted to gain the legitimacy of the revolution. Who is the inheritor of the 1911 revolution? Who is the inheritor of Sun Yat-sen's dream of a modern, strong China and Chinese people that can resist against, colonialism? And the problem has come about is that the CCP has never truly been able to get that as long as there was a Kuomintang or another, what they saw as China. And so as long as there is a separate inheritor to the revolution, they can't stand that. They must have everything. So Taiwan has long been kind of the crown jewel in the CCP's initial foreign policy. They must get Taiwan, bring that into the fold, and therefore the story of the revolution since 1911 is one single event, right? So they were the ones from that. We can see that in some of the propaganda movies they put out. They're saying that CCP was directly from Sun Yat-sen. That's not true. He may have had some socialistic dealings, but Sun Yat-sen was very much a nationalist. And the inheritors to that was more the initial Kuomintang, not kind of what Kuomintang has become, but the initial story of the Kuomintang was the Sun Yat-sen's group. In fact, he had to push out the communists, the CCP side, because they were more beholden to Russia and Stalin at the time than they were to the Chinese people themselves. And so it is both a military necessity to take Taiwan, but also it's ingrained into the CCP's DNA, the ideology of who they are and what they see as the future. They must take Taiwan and erase the actual history of China with the Kuomintang and the revolution of Sun Yat-sen and co-opt that into their own DNA to make their story complete. And so it's kind of a two-front war, the mental and the physical. They need to get Taiwan. And so we don't need to see it just in a military sense. It's also very much a kind of a psychological, political necessity that they have to take Taiwan. So they're going to be very, very focused on it. And one thing I'd also like to bring up is that they're getting very bold. While the President of the United States, Joe Biden, was in Asia, remember there was a joint flight by Russia and China of bombers and warplanes into sovereign airspace where the president was. I mean, this was a direct threat. This was a direct, years before, I couldn't imagine that we wouldn't send people up. But the fact that we didn't respond in kind to that is kind of frightening, because that is a very bold maneuver. In earlier decades, that would have been almost a declaration of war. And so the saber rattling is very real. It's not just words, it's reflected in their actual actions. So when Jennifer says that, she's checked these words out, they also reflected their actual actions overseas and in that region.
Well, look, when the POTUS said pretty much declared war against China in his comments in Asia, I hope that his staff wouldn't have walked those comments back. I think we probably would have been in a stronger position, at least to get into the thinking cycle of the Chinese Communist Party, in this case, President Xi, especially what he was trying to possibly do internally. I know that, you mentioned Burma, and you and I, we're talking about these issues in February of 2015 in Japan on stage, while those two Chinese intelligence officers were sitting in the audiences. And at the same time, fast forward to when I provided the white paper to the National Security Council on the previous POTUS as to what's happening, and delivered the white paper to the shadow minister in Australia. So what China's trying to do there with them, expanding the Belt and Road Initiative, with potash not being really able to move out of Russia, even Middle Eastern countries like Egypt are relying on it now. Israel has to pick up the slack to the tune of 40 billion plus just to be able to support them on a yearly basis. I know that China went into Cuba and signed a agreement for the Belt and Road Initiative, and you got enough potash sitting there that you could sign a 100-year contract, and it will really affect the global economies. You mentioned Africa. I just came back on Friday with the government in exile out of South Sudan that was initially making its declaration. 95% of what South Sudan has is being sucked up by the Chinese. And I know that the Egyptians just went into South Sudan there to provide security protections and support. And with the Egyptians there, that means Israel's there. And I think you're going to see a push between the Abraham Accord countries and Israel against what might be shaping up to be, which is possibly China in the control of Asia. But Jennifer, I do want to come back to you on a recap. As in your dispatch, you had mentioned that the CCP had measured, specifically addressing what you had already discussed, the anti-coup actions. And I know you highlighted some of the possibilities of an internal issues in there. I'm going to kind of give you a little bit of a background story. On Friday when I came back Saturday, we had a graduation party. A friend of mine who was a pilot who was sitting on a tarmac in China because of the issues with the COVID restrictions. And one of the Chinese officials that was wearing his entire full suit was on board, and my buddy asked him, "Hey, I know it's a COVID zero, policy for you guys, but when do you think we can move?" And he said the Chinese officials just lit into Xi himself up and down. And then after he was done ranting about how useless the leader of the Chinese Communist Party is, he said, "This is not being recorded, is it?" And of course, my buddy said, "No, if it was, we wouldn't be sharing with the Chinese anyway." But what does that say when it comes to the zero COVID policy and these atrocities that were committed across China? Even the fact that they have so lack of respect for their own people, they actually send a robot AI dog out there with a loudspeaker to talk to their own people and force them to stay inside. Do you think this suppressing of the dissent that you had kind of talked about it? What groups are those specifically? Is there another way that the CCP talks, as you said, when it comes to this anti-coup information, or is there something else in there that we're not picking up from the U.S. perspective?
Yes, I think I'll just give us a very comprehensive, I think, summarize of what the CCP has been doing internationally. Actually, inside China, since I was a child, we were, singing songs about how we long to liberate Taiwan or to have Taiwan return to China. So that kind of so-called China dream has been going on for decades. But until very recently, I think everybody who lives in China or are watching China issues closely from outside of China can feel now it's a time that everything has reached a tipping point. Just like the big high pressure pot, you can have some pressure and little by little, but there's going to be some kind of point where no more pressure can be added. And if you add it anymore, there will be an explosion. So I think the society of China or the status of China now is very, very close to that final point of explosion. You talk about the COVID issue a while ago. Yes, I think the inhumane, I think, extreme zero COVID policy has made so many people suffer. This morning, I just tweeted a video of people in Shanghai were lining up to leave Shanghai, to escape from Shanghai, and to fly to the US. So a lot of inhumane things are happening there. So Xi Jinping had made a, I think, mess about Chinese economic and also this out of control COVID situation, or the severe suppression it put on its own population. And also the economy is really, really in trouble now. Every indication shows that from their very high rate of unemployment and from the real estate market, and we start to see bank runs. So all these are very, very alarming signs. And we need to remember Xi Jinping is seeking for a third term at the 20th National CCP's Congress in this fall. But he and many other things show that the internal power struggle has never been in such a high degree of tension. The conflicting messages and policies are coming out at the official Chinese media every day. And one day people say, Li Keqiang is the Chinese premier. Li Keqiang is taking over. Now Li Keqiang is the real guy in charge. And the next day, there is another official report actually criticizing Li Keqiang. So the battle is almost open there. So for Xi Jinping, I think he already realized if he has really met with greater challenge than many people have, or maybe than he himself had expected. So all this very, I think, alarming things happening in China, I think, from my point of view, will give him more incentive to wage a war against Taiwan or against internally, to deal with his internal problem. He has more incentive to do so, although he doesn't have 100% guarantee he will win. He may either create a very controllable, maybe smaller scale conflict or a whole out war there. But I think simply from inside China, from the domestic point of view, he has every good reason to start a war, so that to bring the country in an emergency state, maybe in that kind of state, he can say, let's call off this meeting. Let's extend this meeting because now we are at war, we are in an emergency, state. So he doesn't have to, go through that process of trying to be not elected, but to be agreed by other CCP, heavyweight for him to stay. He can get away of that. He can continue to stay power. So I think it's a very traditional way of when you have very unsolvable internal issues, you create an external issue, external enemy, so that you can try to, put another banner inside China and to gather all the forces together and to help him to survive all the crises. I think if otherwise he has very, very big difficult to survive. So that is another very big motivation we should notice and pay attention to. And what's happening in China now, I think it's really, really very close to that tipping point, to that explosion kind of level of pressure inside China.
Well, I think he does have kind of a he does have some flexibility here as a beta test, and Senkaku's Islands of the Japan, I think, are where he could maybe focus on, try to see if he can take limited action there, actions other than war, and see what the U.S. Or this administration's pushback is going to be, and then maybe use that as a means and leverage of getting into Taiwan. But, I do want to focus a bit more on what you had just said when it comes to these anti-coup measures because of the internal issues. So I guess my question would be, what groups are there in the Chinese Communist Party occupied Asia that are the targets of the CCP oppression? Because whether the CCP believes justifiably or not that they pose some kind of a threat against the Chinese Communist Party hold on power, in this case against Xi. I do know that you mentioned the possible other power players in China right now that might be pushing back on Xi having another term. Can you kind of expand a little bit about the different groups that he might be targeting and possibly different individuals?
Yes, I think we just passed the 33 anniversary of Tiananmen massacre. I think in 1989, when millions of Chinese people took to the street to protest against the corruption. At that stage, I think the CCP encountered maybe one of its biggest crises since it came into power for many years, because that is the largest ever open protest from the government, from the public. And the main, I think, the issue at that time, or the main pursuit at that time for the people actually was not to overthrow the CCP, just to ask the CCP to deal with the corruption itself. So because people were fed up by the corruption there. But anyway, the CCP could never, I think, tolerate any kind of different opinions from the public. So we all know the result, the end of that crackdown. So after that, I think 10 years later, in 1999, the CCP found itself another big enemy, which is Falun Gong. Falun Gong is just a kind of Tai Chi-like exercise group or exercise regime, which has 3 principles to follow in our daily life: truth, compassion, forbearance, and 5 sets of exercises. So it was first introduced, I think, 3 years after the Tiananmen massacre in 1992 to the public. And then in 7 years, because it's very obvious health benefits, it attracted in 1999, that's according to the CCP's own internal investigation. In 1999, the Falun Gong had attracted more members than the Communist Party. So it was estimated Falun Gong had about 70 to 100 million followers or practitioners in 1999. So then the CCP felt very much threatened by this group because China, we all know it obtained its power through violence and it maintained its power through violence and lies. So any group, and it's a one-party country, so any group who doesn't, listen to the party, or any group who has something else, or they have some ideology or some pursuit other than what the CCP allows you to pursue, is a threat to the CCP. So in 1999, the CCP launched an overwhelming crackdown against Falun Gong. We must remember this is 70 to 100 million people inside China. But it felt, because of the sheer popularity, they think if someone, stand up in this group, say, let's overthrow the CCP, and then they will be in danger. So that was when they find trouble with Falun Gong. Although Falun Gong is not a political organization, or it does not have any political aspiration or pursuit, but for CCP, anything that is outside its box, it's political. It's against it, because Falun Gong, follow truth, compassion, forbearance. They believe in these principles. They believe in the existence of higher beings. They believe in morality. They don't believe in communism. So that's a problem with the party. So the crackdown of Falun Gong is still going on today, and millions of Falun Gong practitioners could have already become the victim of organ harvesting. The CCP kill them alive, and take off their organs to sell to anybody in the world who need to do an organ transplant. So that persecution is still going on. And then we have the large-scale genocide in Xinjiang area, because in Xinjiang area, for the Uyghurs, most of them are Muslims. Again, Muslims believe in something else than communism, and they found trouble with the Uyghurs in Xinjiang. So millions of them were detained in the concentration camp and be transformed or tortured, so-called re-educated there. And a lot of them also became organ harvesting victim. And then people in Hong Kong, because they want their freedom that the CCP once promised them. They I think in 2019, there were large-scale mass protests against the extradition, bill. I think it's virtually against the CCP's crackdown on Hong Kong's freedom. I think then CCP found problem with Hong Kong people. So virtually, I think the CCP has two big enemies. One group is anybody inside the society who doesn't listen to CCP, or who have showed their aspiration or their pursuit for freedom, or maybe for freedom, religious freedom, or economic freedom, or democracy. They are the CCP's enemy. And also inside the CCP itself, it has different factions, like Jiang Zemin's faction, Zheng Qinghong's faction, Hu Jintao's faction. So different factions also have their own life and death struggle. So because for Xi Jinping, after he came into power, he removed so many high-level and medium-level, low-level CCP members. For those members, if they don't fight back, it means they would lose everything. Many of them already ended up in jail. But for Xi Jinping, if he loses his power, it's also a matter of life and death for himself. That's why he needs to, hold on to his power until he dies. So this is the current status. The general public and the other factions inside the CCP can all be his deadly enemy. That's why I think he can't sleep well at night.
Well, I'm glad that as long as he doesn't sleep well, it seems like there's a lot of internal issues. You kind of laid that out. I know that, Jennifer, you were a practitioner, and I'm not sure if you still are, of the Falun Gong way of life. But I do know that we've had Mitchell Gerber, who's been on our show twice, and he's out of Vietnam. He's been covering it for decades, and we were able to lay out the case for it. And I think it would be a wonderful show in the future. We can concentrate a little bit more on really what's happening there. But I guess, Al, based on what Jennifer just said, my question to you would be, whether there's an invasion or after an invasion of Taiwan, based on what Jennifer is saying, what should be the worry of groups like the Falun Gong when it comes to President Xi's signing of the anti-coup documentation? I guess let's look past an possible invasion of Taiwan has taken place. How would that affect these type of organizations and groups, you think?
Well, for one, it'd be a humanitarian. Sorry.
Go ahead, Jennifer.
Go ahead. Okay, I think inside China, for Falun Gong practitioners, I'll answer your question. Yes, I'm still a Falun Gong practitioner. I was arrested 4 times inside China and thrown into a forced labor camp and tortured nearly to death there for 1 year. So I basically escaped from China in 2001. I had written a memoir of what happening to me and to other Falun Gong practitioners in the labor camp. So it's called Witnessing History, One Woman's Fight for Freedom at Falun Gong. So anybody interested, you can search for that book and take a read. And also, like I said, inside China, for all the Falun Gong practitioners, they are still under the most severe persecution. So this order Xi Jinping signs today, of course, will put everyone, I think, into a kind of another state of unrest or uncertainty. But I think for Falun Gong practitioners inside China, their situation are already bad enough. I don't know how much worse that can be. But for, I think, hundreds of thousands of Falun Gong practitioners in Taiwan, if the CCP really takes over Taiwan, they will face the same fate that their fellow Falun Gong practitioners in mainland China are facing today. So that would be a huge disaster for all those hundreds of thousands of Falun Gong practitioners in Taiwan. So I think they should be very, very worried about what were going to happen. Of course, not only for them. Look at Hong Kong. I think everybody's freedom will be taken away unless you kowtow to CCP, you work for CCP, you become a running dog of CCP. If you want to maintain your dignity, your freedom, I think that's the end of your freedom, of your dignity. So everybody inside Taiwan should really stand up and fight like hell against the CCP's possible intention to take over Taiwan.
Al, your perspective real quick on what Jen just talked about. And then I do have a follow-up question I'm going to ask you, Al, on the unification issue.
Sure. I think, what we just heard from Jennifer is a huge reason of why, more Americans need to listen to this, because this is what doesn't get through kind of the filters that are put into, American CDOs or corporate disinformation outlets. A lot of times we don't hear, the personal stories about what happens, behind what we call kind of the bamboo curtain, right? So what is going on within China, the CCP, and the reality of that usually gets kind of whitewashed over here. You get everybody from, American politicians sometimes to actors that will whitewash what goes on within the CCP and the brutality that they've done to, millions of people over the decades and continue to do to this day never really gets reported. And so having voices like Jennifer's, I think, is extremely important because, here you're looking at someone who survived a concentration camp and came out alive. Millions haven't. Millions have gone into those concentration camps and haven't come out. And as you know, I'm Jewish. So, this kind of resonates a lot personally because we look back at our ancestors and what we had to go through, and you hear this cry of never again, never again, never again, right? We cannot allow this type of genocide ever to happen again. And yet here it is happening. And the very same people that will, I hate to use the term, but tilted windmills 70 years ago or 80 years ago and say, oh, we need to rally against that. Well, what is the point of remembering if you can't correct an evil today? Otherwise it's a vanity exercise. And we need to recognize that there are, in effect, kind of Jews today, and that's the Falun Gong and the Uyghurs. They are being treated like the Nazis treated Jews. And yet, if we don't do anything to them, really, you would have been the same back in 1930s. You would have done nothing to help Jews back in the 30s and the 40s against the Nazis. So we need to recognize that there is a deep crime against humanity ongoing right now. And that it's continually happening. No one has been brought to account for it. And as the CCP now expands, they will bring this crime, which they have done within their own borders, and they will expand it out. And as Jennifer said, there's hundreds of thousands to millions of people in Taiwan, and it would extend beyond that. And they will always need to find an internal enemy. So once they've killed off all the Falun Gong, they'll have to find someone else, and there'll be a new enemy, right? Once the Uyghurs are all killed, once the Falun Gong are all killed or go underground, they will find a new enemy. That is how dictatorships and totalitarian societies always work. You must have an external and an internal enemy. And Falun Gong, unfortunately, as she noted, in the 1990s, that became the internal enemy. They needed to create this. And the other thing is that, who is the enemy to them? I mean, look at Falun Gong. If ever there is, a more, and I'm not Falun Gong, again, I'm Jewish, but, looking at their philosophy, it's not political. It is, it's kind of like the old Qigong, kind of that theory of, you find within yourself, you can heal yourself. In fact, it was sad because I'd read somewhere, in fact, your guest earlier talked about, because the Falun Gong health practices, they lived a clean life, they had good organs. That made them even more of a target because guess what? I don't have to worry about this liver having psoriasis because they're alcoholics, because they work against this. They keep themselves healthy, they keep themselves good, but that just means you've got good organs. So, I mean, it's kind of sad that it's unfortunate that that's happening. So I think we need to recognize that that there are internal divisions within China. That China is the CCP. I should correct that. The CCP is basically the Nazi government of now. They're doing the same things. They're targeting people based on religious practices, on ethnic origin, and they are eradicating them and doing it in a totalitarian way. There is no difference morally between Hitler's Germany and Xi's CCP. None. But what we have to decide now and today and tomorrow is, how do we address this? What do we do? First is, of course, recognize it and call it out for the evil that it is. That's number one. And Jennifer does a great job in bringing that, here is this example. And she does it courageously because even here in the United States, there's still, some persecution that goes against them. Australia, they're beating people up in the street that say that, Xi's a criminal. There's different gangs that run around that enforce that kind of political ideology outside the borders of the CCP. But the other thing I'd like to point out that she brought up, which is very important, is the internal political divisions, even within the CCP. So you have members of the CCP that don't like Xi. And I think that might present, I hate to use the word opportunity, but an opportunity for perhaps a peaceful resolution. If Xi can kind of be moved out, like she said, he's in a tough spot. You have to expand, otherwise you'll die. His clique will go down because they're in such trouble. They've mismanaged the whole inside of China. There's never been probably more disparity between rich and poor in China. Their economic policies, if you're not subsidized by basically U.S. money buying your manufactured goods, you have a tough time finding markets. There's a huge problem with the way that Xi has mismanaged China. He has marginalized, well over half his population. It's just not good. And the internal frictions in there are what might be able to do that and to bring about a change within China before it goes to war. So I think Americans need to educate themselves more on listening to voices like Jennifer about who are these folks within China that might bring about that change internal without having to collapse, everything and lead to war before something changes. So I think that's important to kind of recognize those differences. So anyway, that's all I have.
Well, look,
she did well.
I think Xi has pretty much put himself in the position where the Iranian hardliners at. There's no place to flex. So based on what you're saying, but based on what Jennifer is really emphasizing, it seems like if you stick with the current leadership, we're looking at war. unless a change happens internally. And I'm not sure if the current administration, with the people it has, is willing to kind of push back on it. Look, you mentioned going back to the Nazis. I mean, you had a lot of American companies that were really tied and supportive of that particular type of a regime. God bless him for Henry Ford for giving us a car, but you as a person from the Jewish descent should know his viewpoints on the Jews, and even what he even wrote about them. And I wouldn't be surprised in the modern time, if there's let's say, China goes in and under their belief unifies Taiwan, the first people who are going to be pushing out those movies would be Disney, making them look like, they had all the rights in the world to do it. Unfortunately, if you cannot control our own companies, these non-state actors, I don't know how we're going to be able to push back on them. Look, we even mentioned the whole not the TSMC, I should say, that the Tesla, as far as what it has, and also what Elon Musk was able to bring to bear in support of the Ukrainians in their fight against Russia. Even his companies, most of the manufacturing facilities are sitting in areas where, as Jennifer talked about, where the genocides are taking place. And I'm not sure even somebody like him, who could push against possibly Russia as a non-state actor and do things that even some nation states cannot do, is willing to push when it comes to against China, given the fact that he may use his entire manufacturing base. So Al, with that said, I know, I want to bring Jen back for closing comment, but I do want to kind of get to this question. When it comes to what China is talking about, when it comes to unification, as I said, using the similar terms that Russia was using with Ukraine, especially they even mentioned TSMC. What do you think that's based on historically? Why are they pushing that narrative right now?
Well, first off, I'd say, the term unification is carrying water for the CCP. That's the term that they use. And the CCP never owned Taiwan. The island of Taiwan was never owned by the CCP. It was militarily administered by the Kuomintang, which was a government within the mainland China from 45 onward, but through kind of a combination of diplomatic inertia and normal organic processes, Taiwan became a free state. They became a democratic republic, and they have actually, in fact, a few years ago, they actually voted out the Kuomintang, and the Democratic Progressive Party kind of took over. So they literally have voted their own government in. They're a self-sufficient government under the terms of the United Nations charters about what is a self-determination of peoples, right? So this is an internationally recognized rule, and Taiwan fits that bill now. The CCP never owned any slice of Taiwan territory, never. In fact, if you look at it, the Kuomintang technically didn't either. So from 1911, when the Kuomintang, it's argued that the Republic of China became about, Taiwan was not. It was considered terra nullius before that. The Japanese grabbed it, I think, 1898, and so it was never a part of this. And so this whole myth about a unification is a misnomer. It's and again, it parallels. I hate to use the parallels because it's kind of Thompson's law, but the parallels back to Nazi Germany, saying this is all German because they speak German. So anybody that speaks German is part of Nazi Germany. That's untrue. You can speak a language, you can have a certain culture, and it's arguable if you're speaking the same language, even, right? Because there's nuances, there's difference. Saying the Latin language, for example, is pan-Europeanism. If you speak a Latin-based language, you're automatically part of Mussolini's Italy. No, you're not. Give me a break. So by saying that it's a unification, it's not. Right? It's a conquest. It's an invasion and a conquest of a sovereign nation. And, I can understand the CCP saying it because, they use euphemisms for everything. As Jennifer has noted, they're very careful about the words and how they phrase things. The most interesting one was she pointed out the other day, they said literally they're going to take back the TMSC, a company that was founded by a Taiwanese that was never part of the CCP. It was never part of it, but they're going to take it back. So, I mean, they create these kind of fantasies, and that's baked into the DNA of the CCP. The CCP has never been able to write an effective history. History is simply a tool. It's a weapon. Information, words are weapons. It's a tool of war for them, and they're very good at it. I mean, they've got half the Americans fooled about most things. I mean, we literally talk about a one China policy and believe that Beijing somehow has some sort of legal, moral, or historical right to Taiwan. It doesn't. And so we have to recognize the CCP for what it is and recognize the organizational structure, how it came about, and how it gained its occupation of the mainland Asia in 1947 to 48. because largely they were backed by Russia. Stalin absolutely gave them, a tremendous amount of resources at the same time that America betrayed the Kuomintang. We had supported them, and then, as you know, Marshall pulled back his support for Kuomintang, left Chiang Kai-shek hanging, and then created a government in exile on the island of Taiwan, which was they were given the occupation. America occupied Okinawa, and then China Kuomintang was to do a military occupation of Taiwan to administer it, and then decide at some later date what the status was going to be. And so, we have to really honestly look at these things. And the problem is that most Americans don't look at an honest or a real view about China. They don't. There's kind of this mystery of China. They don't listen to voices like Jennifer. They don't listen to anything but these pronouncements that come through. So by saying things like one China policy or the unification of Taiwan, we're giving into CCP propaganda. We have to be careful about that. And as you said, we also have to be very careful about how they have co-opted our own organizations. Chinese money, which is basically laundered American money. So American pay, for huge companies and factories. We use slave labor. Let's be honest. We use slave labor in China. And that's known. I mean, Apple, every time you pick up an iPhone, you're picking up something that a slave has created. And that's the moral failing, unfortunately, of many Americans in the West. We didn't recognize that we were using Chinese slave labor to make our cheap products. And we paid billions, trillions of dollars to China. And there is nothing outside of the state within China. The CCP owns everything. So there's not a private organization. They use that money to advance their causes, the CCP political causes. And what they did was they used a lot of that money to come back over to the US, pull the wool over our eyes, to co-opt and corrupt, and to create a safe system in the United States where they could move their propaganda and move their agenda. And unfortunately, a lot of Americans just saw the dollar signs, and we were corrupted. We followed that money that was coming back from China and gave up our morals. We sold our morals out. So when the things happened, like in the Tiananmen Square massacre in 1989, when the Falun Gong started, the genocide against Falun Gong, organ harvesting in 1999 to today, when these things happen, the Uyghurs till today, we kind of sold out our own morals. And we need to look at ourselves as a nation, as a people, and as a community and go, okay, well, where do we draw our morals, and when are we going to say enough is enough, and face up to the reality of what is the CCP, what have they done, and now, more importantly, what are we going to do about it? What can we do about it? So that's my 2 cents.
It's unfortunate, even if China is mentioning, or I should say the CCP is mentioning TSMC, Arctic Child must be in trouble because he's still linked to the Green Gang anyway, historically and by blood. So it is what it is. Jennifer.
Well, and that's the important part about Taiwan. I'll put one thing in here. I forgot one thing. So TSMC has, because of what we did, was we offshored a lot of our production. TSMC actually produces, in some cases, up to 80% of the components of our critical defense and security. So if China grabs Taiwan, this is unlike Ukraine. If Russia takes over Ukraine, we'll just grow more wheat over here. That's, there's nothing really, maybe some free, some neon or something like that, but there's really nothing critical in Ukraine for the United States. In Taiwan, if they grab Taiwan, two things happen. Number one is the TSMC, which is the foundry for almost 80% of a lot of electronics in the United States, including security and defense. That goes away. That goes into the hands of the CCP. They gain an immense amount of manufacturing capability of that technology. They have their huge chip manufacturing right there in TSMC that can be then used against the free world. The second thing that happens is they've extended their line out. Taiwan is a massive, as it was called, in the 1930s and 40s, it's a massive aircraft carrier, right? So that projects their power even more into the ocean, and they can interdict 80% of the trade coming through that area to the West. In other words, they can literally create, now that they've got the Solomon Islands, they've worked with that, as you see in the reader there, Samoa and
Burma,
Indonesia.
Solomon Islands, they control everything,
They extend that bamboo curtain. They extend that bamboo curtain right through Southeast Asia, and most of that trade that comes through that region, they interdict, they block, they control, and that is absolutely dangerous. Taiwan is an absolutely critical for the national security of the United States and the free world. I mean, let's be honest with it. So this is absolutely critical. It's very important that we keep our pulse on it. But right now, everybody's talking Ukraine, but people need to be listening to people like Jennifer and others that are saying, hey, guys, guess what? This is actually going on over here in Taiwan, and recognize why Taiwan is absolutely, as Colin Powell said, why this is critical for U.S. national security. And Ukraine, it's morally there, but if it goes away, we're not going to die. If Taiwan goes away, we're hurting. And like you said, the stock market, that's going to take a big hit if we lose up to 80% of some of our components' ability to be able to be rebuilt in semiconductors.
Especially if it happens over the next couple of months, imagine what would happen. It would implode, or I don't think the fail-safe would be able to save the stocks here with what's happening. Maybe the best thing is there's a war, and then even those West executives who tried to bypass the sanctions that the previous POTUS had put on behalf of American companies who still do business in China, who are now in the administration, current POTUS's administration, even they may not be able to do anything about it, when the military commanders would have to show up on the table, put the paperwork in front of the POTUS and say, you have no option, you get attacked, and here is a battle plan. And maybe that would be the reset. Unfortunately, war usually is. Jennifer, I know that Al and I kind of talked at the end a little bit on the issue, but it was really kind of covering all the points that you put out in much more simpler and easier term than we were kind of discussing for the audience. But I do want to give you the last word on everything that we've talked about. Where do we go from here? You're an expert. You understand the region. Are we just going to be heading down the road for war, or where do we go from here, I guess?
I think I want to make 3 points. Number one, we need to remember, if we feel threatened today by the CCP, it is exactly the West, the United States, and the world that has given the CCP the capability to threat the world today. If the CCP had not been allowed to join the WTO and was not allowed to to steal the technology, to force the technology transfer, and to steal the technology from the West, the CCP would never ever had its power it is having now to threat the world. So this is a number one lesson and a number one issue we need to remember. And number two very important issue is, I think there are some people both outside China and inside China who are hoping, let's get rid of Xi Jinping. Let's replace Xi Jinping with another better leader inside the CCP, but keep the CCP system so that we can go back to our old happy days when Wall Street can make money with the CCP elites together at the expense, of course, of Chinese people and ordinary public outside of China. So there's no good guys inside the CCP. Xi Jinping is appointed. Sometimes people are talking about maybe Jiang Zemin is better, Hu Jintao is better. We need to remember Xi Jinping was chosen by Jiang Zemin, by Hu Jintao. So he is inevitably being who he is. He's learning from Mao Zedong. There's no virtually good guys inside the CCP system. If there maybe have one or two, but as soon as there's good guy like Zhao Ziyan and Hu Yaobang, they were two relatively better guys inside the CCP, but they couldn't survive this evil system of the CCP, so they were get rid of very soon. And Zhao Ziyan was imprisoned until his death after he was removed after the Tiananmen massacre because he didn't support the Tiananmen massacre. He was imprisoned until he died, although he was once the head of the CCP. So the number two issue, very important, is there's no good guy inside the CCP. If we really want to find a solution for this, for China, and to bring China as a civilized member into our international community, we need to empower the Chinese people for them to get rid of the CCP once and for all and establish a civilization like all the other modern civilization like the Western society and the free world is having. And that's the real solution. Don't have any illusion. I think about the CCP is going to change for better. We've been going down that path for the past 40 years, and today is where we are now. Are we going to want to repeat our mistake? Never. So the only hope, I think, and there's only, I think, one thing the United States and the world can help to do, that is to tear down the CCP's Great Firewall. It was established, I think, with the technology of CCP. That is very unfortunate. So the CCP is blocking all the information from outside of China. So it's brainwashing its people. It's doing information or misinformation, inside the Chinese public. So if we can tear down the CCP's Great Firewall and enable the Chinese people to learn the truth and to find out what the CCP has done in history and right now, I think the real hope and the healthy, so-called healthy development or next step can happen, or hopeful things can happen. It's the only thing that we can empower the Chinese people inside China to realize what the CCP is and stand up and fight against the CCP. So I think that is not so hard to do, but we lack, number one, like I said, the recognition, the acknowledgement of what the CCP really is. And of course, number two is the political will to deal with. I think it is much easier and much, much less cost to deal with the CCP with a war or inside a war to help the Chinese people, to empower the Chinese people with I think a very simple act. If we really have the political power, technically, it is not that hard at all to tear down the CCP's Great Firewall. Like Elon Musk is helping Ukrainian people now. That kind of technology, I think it's very, very much less cost than we go into a war against the CCP. If we are forced to, we have to. But I think there are better ways to do it. That is to empower the Chinese people and help them to stand up against the CCP. And I think it's about time people's, I think, ability to endure what is happening. Like my last program said, young generations in Shanghai, in China, are declaring we are the last generation. When the police told them, if you are punished for refusing to be taken to the quarantine site, 3 generations of your family would be affected. And they announced this is our last generation. So that is the degree of despair of young people in China now. So if people is at that kind of despair, it is, I think, just give them a little bit of free information and hope that things can't get much, much worse. If they fight back, they already are dying and they are already don't want any children. So things can't get any worse. So what if they stand up, if they can get rid of their fear, and if more people realize there are so other people thinking about the same, and if we all stand up against the CCP, if the CCP cannot control the information and separate people anymore, I think that is the real hope that we can hope for what's happening in China. So I always, I've calling for this for years, for the West to try to help the Chinese people to tear down the CCP's Great Firewall and get them to support the Chinese people's own pursuit for freedom, for free information, and for good things to happen within China.
Thank you very much, Jennifer, and well said in the recap. Amazing. We the people works everywhere here and also in Asia. We just got to empower the people. With that said, I want to make sure our audiences know that if you take a look at the QR code, as you know, you could go to Jennifer's YouTube page, and she does have a blog also. And of course, Jennifer is going to be joining me on Wednesday. We do a follow-up after our show broadcast on Clubhouse at 7 o'clock p.m. So please make sure that you follow her, subscribe to her page on YouTube, and then come and ask the questions, more details to follow as we have our discussions on Clubhouse this coming Wednesday, 7 o'clock Eastern Time. With that also said, I do want to make sure our audience know I just came back Friday from our mission in Kenya. We did do a distribution from United Assembly Appeal in support of the South Sudanese refugees that are suffering because of even what the CCP is doing in South Sudan. Intention is to be able to expand our capabilities with other 501c3s that are operating out of Kenya to be able to support those individuals. And also we got some bad news again that it might be even getting worse for the Christians of northern Iraq, to include possibly looking at options of how we have to remove those individuals from Iraq over the coming year, unfortunately. So please support as much as you can, and it helps us with our operational costs. More importantly, thank you very much for Fred and the Cinema Production for the ability to give us to have these type of wonderful shows and guests like Jennifer. Jen, Al, it was a pleasure. We're going to continue this again. Jennifer, we'll have you back in the future. I look forward to having more of a discussion with you on Wednesday. And with that said, God bless to our audiences. And this is New Paradigms.
Thank you.